Hello, my name is Paul Sevilla, and I'm a librarian for the Livermore Public Library. Tonight's program is part of the 17th annual Livermore Reads Together community reading program, featuring the book, The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore. Thank you to the Friends of the Livermore Library for sponsoring Livermore Reads Together. And thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. I encourage attendees to type their questions in the chat. And I want to make sure that attendees are able to chat, to use chat. So I'll make sure that everyone will be able to do that. So it is truly an honor for me to introduce our special guest this evening. Dr. Joe W. Gray is currently Professor Emeritus in the Biomedical Engineering Department at Oregon Health and Science University. He serves on the board of counselors for the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, which studies the long-term effects of radiation on atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He recently served as chair of a committee of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, charged with developing a strategic plan for low-dose radiation research for the United States. Dr. Gray worked in the Biomedical Science Division at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and was Associate Laboratory Director for Biosciences and Life Sciences at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Here to help us understand radiation is Dr. Joe Gray. Hello, Doctor.
Paul, thanks for having me on the program. It sounds like a really exciting venture that you have going here.
Thank you. And so I guess we'll just get to the questions. Are people able to, let me just make sure that attendees are able to use a chat. Sorry, this attendees can chat with everyone. Okay, now it's enabled. So, just attendees, just type in your questions in the chat for the doctor, and I will be monitoring the chat and bringing the questions up to our guests. So, doctor, let's begin with the first question. What is radiation and how are people exposed to it?
It's actually a complicated question. There are multiple types of radiation. It really comes in two fundamental forms. You have particles that are moving at relatively high speed that interact with the atoms and nuclei that comprise the materials that make up life and the universe. And we also have electromagnetic radiation, which is really kind of like light, but higher energy. So photons and particles, and these come at various energies, and they come at various rates. And so both the energy and the rate determine the effects that they have on the materials that they interact with. The more heavily they interact with them, the more changes they make. And in the context of human health, when you start interacting with the atoms and molecules that make us up, then you can do some damage. And it is some of this damage that can result in the health effects that are ultimately ascribed to radiation. And there are many different forms of, or sources of radiation, if you will. I mean, probably some of the ones that we're most familiar with are X-rays, things that are used to diagnose diseases, check for broken bones, and so on. People are often exposed to very high doses of radiation in efforts to kill cancers. These would be beams of radiation that are focused on a tumor to try to eradicate it. Obviously, when you're trying to do diagnostics, you try to keep the dose as low as possible while still revealing what you want to see. But X-rays, CAT scans are common sources of radiation. Radiopharmaceuticals, sometimes these are used either to treat disease or as diagnostic reagents. And of course, we can be occupationally exposed to radiation. Just as a result of working with radiation sources, or perhaps working around a reactor or an accelerator. Cosmic rays are something that astronauts have to worry about. The longer they're out there, the more cosmic rays they may be associated or exposed to. Airline travel, doses are pretty low, but if you fly enough, there is some exposure there. So and also in our world, there are naturally occurring radioactive materials that we're exposed to all the time. And so we live in a world of mostly very low level radiation, but it's there all the time.
And yeah, you talked about sources of radiation. Do everyday objects emit radiation, such as cell phones and television, computers, and other electronics?
Well, they do emit radiation, but one of the issues here is whether or not the radiation is of a type that actually induces damage. And so some of the forms of radiation, I would say that from cell phones, for example, there are radio waves. We live in a universe of radiation from TVs and so on. That's typically not at an energy that causes any damage. It just doesn't interact with the materials that comprise you. And so I think the evidence for that having health effects is pretty small.
I see. And how can I tell if something is radioactive? Is that possible without, is there a tool that we use or?
Well, there are a number of tools. Obviously, people have been measuring radiation for over a century now. And typically the way this is done is to build a device that in which the radiation interacts either with a gas or with a solid in a way that produces an electrical signal. And you can basically count the number of signals that result as the individual radiation particles go through the material. There's some more exotic techniques where, for example, you can make a box of very humid air and keep it at just the right temperature. And when these particles go through that, they actually make little vapor trails, and you can see them. There are a number. Then that's not a standard technology. Usually, you just use some sort of a dosimeter. I mean, film. Radiation will cause grains to form in film, and so you can detect it that way.
I see. And how does radiation, you kind of touched upon this earlier, but how exactly does radiation affect people's health?
Well, there are a variety of ways, and it's pretty complicated. Probably the most important way is that the ionizing radiation event will interact with a critical component of a cell. And I think the component of a cell that most people focus on is the DNA. So obviously, DNA is the molecule in each of your cells that encodes how it is that cell functions. Ultimately, it gets translated into proteins that allow the cell to do what it does. And sometimes radiation will interact with the coding part of the DNA in ways that change it, that damage it. Now, we have evolved really amazingly effective repair systems that almost always repair this right or alternately kill the cell that has been damaged. But every now and then, you'll do a little damage to the DNA, and that causes aberrant function in that cell. It could be a cancer. It could cause cataracts. In cases of very high exposure, it could cause nausea or even neural problems.
I see. And are there medical treatments that can help limit or treat the health effects of certain types of radiation in a radiological or nuclear emergency?
Well, there are some. Obviously, limiting exposure is the right way to do it, and so moving away from the event is probably the first thing to think about. But some types of radiation are external to the body, and some types of radiation are internal to the body. If they're external, then shielding tends to work. If they're internal, then they may, these radioactive materials are often chemically similar to elements that our bodies normally use. So calcium, iodine, and so on. And so, for example, radon is similar, radium is similar to calcium. And so it gets incorporated into the bones. And so there are chemical ways that one can begin to treat you. Let's say if you're exposed to strontium, which would tend to act like iodine, you can give iodine to try to block the uptake of the radiological materials. So, and there are ways to precipitate out the metals to try to get them out of the body. So there are a few treatments in cases where there are really very high level exposures. People have attempted to do things like replace some of the damaged cells, the bone marrow cells and so on. You can mitigate some of the effects to the gut. Radiation tends to preferentially affect rapidly dividing cells. And so it's often, those are the cells in the body that tend to need to be cared for. Okay. But yeah, a few methodologies, but by and large, the best strategy is to not be exposed. Absolutely.
Yes. Just type in your questions in the chat if you have any questions. How can people protect themselves from the health effects of radiation exposure?
I think the most important thing is to be aware of when you are being or might be exposed, and to ask always the question, is the exposure that I'm going to receive justified by the benefit that I would receive from that exposure? And if you have a broken bone and it needs to be assessed for the break, then having that X-ray is a perfectly, I would make the decision, sure, let's have the X-ray, knowing that there is some small chance that that would do some damage. But I have to say that the vast majority of radiation that we, the public, get exposed to is infinitesimal, compared to that has really been associated with diseases of the types that I've been talking about. So most of the time, I think that you could probably, if you're in a medical situation, you should certainly ask. But I think that by and large, the medical community has carefully made the assessment that the gain is far greater than the risk. Mm-hmm. But in the case of a radiological exposure, something like that, then distance and shielding is the right way to think about it.
Absolutely. And so can you tell us more about your research on the health effects of low-level radiation exposures?
Well, I will tell you about the research that's going on in the field. It's by far greater than what I've been doing. But I started off my career developing technologies at Livermore, which were specifically designed to detect the long remaining effects of radiation in humans. They were specifically designed to identify genetic damage that was suffered by the A-bomb survivors. That was one of the techniques actually still used, but it was a technique that allowed us to understand how much those individuals had been exposed to. And what that then allowed us to do is to make a correlation between how much radiation you got and what kind of health effects you developed, kinds of cancer, numbers of cancers, cataracts, and so on. And so I started off developing tools that would help us to understand how much damage we were doing. And then as time went on, it became clear that it's not just the DNA damage that's important in the health effects of radiation. Radiation influences a lot of the cells in the body. It influences the immune system. It influences the vasculature. It influences the cells that line the body and so on. Until very recently, we haven't had tools that were sufficiently sensitive to detect the effects of radiation, the kinds of radiation and the levels of radiation that you and I might actually be exposed to. And so in recent years, my research and that of the field has focused more and more on taking some of these exquisitely sensitive new technologies and asking the question, what are the effects of the radiation that we actually receive on the body? Right now, most of our regulatory processes are based on the idea that we've measured effects in the A-bomb survivors at high dose and extrapolated those to low dose. Now, I think we're in a situation where we're going to be able to more directly measure what goes on in the doses that are actually important to most of the US population.
I see. So, what are some of the common misconceptions about the radiation that you'd like, and how can we dispel them?
So there are a number of things that I think are worth knowing, and that is that when we think about diseases that radiation is thought to cause, like cancer, there are many causes for cancer. And especially when you think about the doses of radiation that we mostly receive, the probability, if we were to get cancer, the probability that that was caused by the radiation, in most cases, is pretty small. There are many other factors that play into this. Smoking, just general environmental exposure to things that damage DNA, et cetera, poor immune system, and so on. So I think that we need to appreciate the fact that even though we may get exposed to some low level of radiation, the fact that we get a cancer that's associated with radiation doesn't mean that it was caused by the radiation. And so I think that, most people tend to make a pretty direct linkage between disease and some radiation exposure. And I think we're getting smarter about how to distinguish between radiation-induced cancers and cancers that are induced, or diseases that are induced by other forms, but we're not there yet. And so, I think that's one thing to think about. I also mentioned the fact that we calculate what the effects of radiation are, low dose radiation are on populations. But those are extrapolations from higher levels. And so I think that we need to be careful about, thinking about those extrapolations and thinking that they're grounded in reality. This program that helped design, in fact, specifically called for research on the levels of radiation that we're exposed to, rather than relying on these extrapolations. So I think that we're getting to the point where we can move from extrapolation to true knowledge.
And so what are some good sources that you can recommend to help people learn and understand radiation more? Is there like a book or a website you can recommend?
One of the interesting places I would send people to is the website for the Radiation Effects Research Foundation. It catalogs, it tells you about the studies that they've been doing. Probably many people don't know that the Radiation Effects Research Foundation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki has been following the health effects in over 100,000 exposed Japanese for almost 80 years now. And perhaps as many as 50,000 of their offspring. So we're learning a tremendous amount from these very generous volunteers that go in, periodic medical examinations and really have helped us to understand what we know about what radiation does to people.
And what is the website address for that? I'm going to share it on the chat.
Just Google Radiation Effects Research Foundation. And
okay. All right. Just shared that. Oops. Let me see.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat here.
Okay. Tell me what that is.
It's quite a long question.
All right, I'll pull up chat. Let's see.
It's like it has something to do with that.
Yeah, I'm reading it. So there is no question that radiation does influence. I mean, it depends. So the question here is, had radiation treatment some years ago. It depends a little bit on where the radiation treatment was, how exactly it is that they did it, the extent of the body that was irradiated, and so on. But generally speaking, hypothyroid. It certainly, radiation does affect the blood-forming organs of the body. So the white blood cell count could be affected. I mean, I'm not. First off, I'm not an MD, so you're on your own for my medical diagnosis here. But we know that radiation affects the rapidly growing cells in the body. So those include those that form the blood. They also include those that form the gut, the intestine. And so, yeah, I would say that there's no question that especially high dose radiation can have adverse effects on the body. And the details of your treatment, I don't know enough about to even make a guess, but it's possible.
Okay, thank you for that question. So let's talk about the Radium Girls. I understand that you read the book. So yeah, what are your thoughts about the factory workers who contracted radiation poisoning from painting watch dials with self-luminous paints? And what stuck out to you the most reading the book?
The thing that really occurred to me most strikingly was the difference at the time between what was known scientifically about the effects of radiation and what was perceived publicly to be the benefits of this same radiation. I mean, I think that if you would have asked the scientists at the time, and the book sort of brings this out, is radiation good for you? The answer would have been no. But somehow the public, the media had portrayed radiation, partly probably for misconceptions on the part of the public, just public rumors, as being good for you. And so if there had been better communication between the scientists who were knowledgeable about what it actually did and the public who was trying to consume the materials, I think that wouldn't have happened. And this problem persists today. There is continually a barrier between people who are subject matter experts in some aspect of radiation and the community. And I think that the more we can do to have dialogues about what is and is not true about radiation, the more the public will be able to make informed decisions about its merits and demerits. So that was one thing. The other thing that struck me was that the radium is a bone-seeking compound. So as they described in the book, it went into the jaws of the young women and caused, just massive decay of the bone structure. Most of the radiation from radium doesn't penetrate very far. If they had just dusted their hair, they wouldn't have had those problems. It's just, this practice that they had of pointing the paintbrushes out so that they were actually ingesting the stuff internally is what really caused the really amazingly bad outcomes that these poor women experienced. But just a little knowledge of what was going on there could probably also have even as dial painters, they probably could have done that in a way that would have been much, much safer.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I have one last question for you, unless there are any questions from the chat here, and feel free to enter them in the chat. So what other things would you like the public to know about radiation exposure?
I think the thing that we need to think about as we think about exposure to radiation and to other compounds in the environment that may cause damage to us is that we're always dealing with a trade-off. That in most cases, I'm not talking about radiological disasters, but just in general, in terms of our exposure, there are attributes and there are problems. And I think that one of the things that's worth the public digging into on their own is the actual data that's out there about the magnitude of the effects that the radiation that we're exposed to really cause. And I think that, for the most part, if you compare the dangers of radiation to the dangers of other things that we're exposed to in life, that for the most part, they're not outsized. They're not much higher than other things that we're willingly accepting as risks. I think the thing that makes radiation uncomfortable is you can't see it. And so it's an unknown. And so, and I think everybody are rightfully worried about what we can't see. But I think that, the government and the community in general is doing as well as they know how to do at this point of protecting us. We're still working in an area of uncertainty, just, at the low doses that we're getting. No question that it's worth worrying about, but I think that we should always be thinking about, what is the cost-benefit ratio for this, and everybody has to make their own judgment on that. But the data is beginning to be out there that allow people to make informed decisions on that topic.
Okay. Well, once again, thank you, Dr. Gray, for sharing your time with us. We're so grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you. And please join us for our other Livermore Reads Together events. Let me see if there's a comment here from Hannah. Sorry, not concluded yet. So I just want to make sure that comment is addressed. It's just thanking you for your work in educating the public. And it says your research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab was commercialized as a diagnostic that has had great impact in the business world. Talk about how the book and in the Radium Girls, the business took advantage of the public's misunderstanding of the effects of radiation. And thank you for educating the public. So,
well, my pleasure. Happy to be here. Hope to see you in person in Livermore sometime.
Yes, absolutely. So please join us for other Livermore Reads Together events. We're hosting a Readers Theater presentation on the Radium Girls by Encore Players this Thursday, March 16th at 7 p.m. here at the Civic Center Library. Visit our website at library.livermoreca.gov or follow us on social media to learn about our events and programs. So thank you again, Dr. Gray, for doing this. And to you and to all our attendees, have a great evening.
You too. Thank you, Paul.